Musician Elvis Castillo has released a total of 24 studio albums, at least as of this recording. If we were to cut those albums right in half, at exactly the middle would be the 12th album, Spike, released in 1989. While he was certainly a star before 1989, Elvis Castillo's song from Spike called Veronica was a team-up with Paul McCartney that turned out to be, at the time, Elvis's biggest single in the U.S. Of course, that was decades ago, way back when MTV used to actually play music videos. In fact, Elvis's video for Veronica was the first music video directed by the Australian director John Hillcoat. It was hardly his last. John would go on to direct music videos for Bush, Placebo, Him, Depeche Mode, Muse, Bob Dylan, Johnny Cash, and plenty more stars. In 2011, John was given the reins on a budget of about $26 million to bring Lawless to the big screen. Despite what Hollywood might consider a meager budget, Lawless had an all-star cast consisting of Shia LaBeouf, Tom Hardy, Jason Clarke, Jessica Chastain, Mia Wasikowska, Guy Pearce, Dane DeHaan, and Gary Oldman, just to name a few. The film Lawless was released the next year, 2012, and while $26 million is a lot of money to you and I, as far as Hollywood is concerned, it's not really a massive budget. So anytime a movie like that is able to attract such an all-star cast, that means one thing. It wasn't really the money that attracted them. It was the story that attracted them. In this case, the story from Lawless is based on the book by Matt Bondurant called The Wettest County in the World. In his book, Matt tells the story of his own family during Prohibition. His grandfather Jack, who's portrayed on screen by Shia LaBeouf, and his two grand-uncles, Forrest, as played by Tom Hardy in the movie, and Howard, who's played by Jason Clarke. Unfortunately, for those of us wanting to know how much of the movie Lawless was truth, so much of what happened with illegal moonshining in Virginia during Prohibition just isn't documented, and for good reason. So this week, I decided to do something a little different here on the show. I recently had the chance to sit down and chat with Jack's grandson and the man who wrote the book that the movie is based on, Matt Bondurant. So let's dig into how much of Lawless is true. I'm Dan Lefebvre, and this is based on a true story. It's time for Two Truths and a Lie. Listen closely for the two truths scattered throughout the episode. Then, by a process of elimination, you'll know which one is a lie. And of course, we'll do a recap at the end of the episode to see how well you did. Okay, here are the two truths and one lie. Number 1. Forrest Bondurant did survive having his throat cut. Number 2. Charlie Rakes was not actually from Chicago. Number 3. Jack Bondurant was not shot in the big shootout at the end of the movie. Before we get back to the show, I want to say thank you to Riley Lewis Morris for becoming a patron of the show and recommending that we cover Lawless. This whole episode is because of Riley, so thanks so much for your support, Riley. I had a blast chatting with Matt and learning more about the true story behind the movie, and I hope you will too. So without further ado, let's jump into the interview as we compare history with Hollywood's version of Lawless. This week, I'm super excited to be joined by Matt Bondurant. Matt is the author of The Wettest County in the World, the book that was adapted into the movie Lawless and tells the story of his grandfather, Jack Bondurant, as well as his two grand-uncles, Forrest and Howard. Thanks so much for your time, Matt.
Sure, no problem. Glad to be here.
Now, before we start to chat about Lawless, I actually want to ask you about your last name because I might have already mispronounced it. I know in the movie they actually pronounce it a few different ways. Bondurant, Bondurant, Bondurant. How do you pronounce your last name?
We say Bondurant.
Bondurant?
But a lot of people in Franklin County say Bondurant. They sort of they kind of allied the last a little quicker, Bondurant. And so it's a little confusing because my father left Franklin County when he joined the Navy. And so the kind of in Northern Virginia, the northern pronunciation is Bondurant, but down in Franklin County they say Bondurant. And then the movie, of course, they had, you have a bunch of English and Australian people trying to say that. So that's what happens.
So in a way, they're kind of, some of them are correct and some of them are not.
Yeah.
Nice. All right. So with that clarified, I want to talk about the title of the book, because in the beginning, Shia LaBeouf, who plays Jack, your grandfather, has a voiceover that mentions Franklin County is known as the wettest county in the world, which is also the title of your book. So was that something that Franklin County was actually known for back then, or was that something the filmmakers were kind of working in to add in the title of your book?
No, that was a name or a title that was given to the county. The first known reference that I could find to it was from the writer Sherwood Anderson, who plays a pretty big role in the book. He's not in the movie at all, but in the book he's a pretty big role. And he wrote an article for a magazine when he was sort of investigating the great moonshine conspiracy, Franklin County moonshine conspiracy of 1935, which and he wrote, in the sentence he says, where they're producing more alcohol than any place else, the wettest county in the world is Franklin County, Virginia. Mm-hmm. And then that kind of that stuck, and it's been known, Franklin County has been known as the wettest county in America for a long time, and it's a kind of a dubious distinction, I guess, but it's something that pretty well known in that part especially that part of the state. Yeah.
Interesting. So the movie actually takes place in 1931. Is that correct? I mean, I saw the text on screen that mentioned that. Is that basically the kind of the right time frame for the events, or I know a lot of times in movies the time frame they change that, or was that pretty accurate?
It's slightly adjusted. For example, the incidents at Maggoty Creek Bridge where my grandfather and his brothers get shot, which is the climax of the film. That was December of 1930, but it's right around there. And within the book too, because it's a fictionalization of the true story, I compressed some events, a little bit, and adjusted some things, trying to kind of put the narrative together in a kind of a more seamless fashion. But it's basically very close. The other thing I'll say from the onset is there's a lot of the incidents, except for things like the shooting, because that was something that was reported obviously in court transcripts and in the newspaper. Everything else, relatively unrecorded, hard to find in terms of specific dates or times and things like that. So there was, which is great for me as a novelist. There's a lot of flexibility, so I can work it in. But no, I think that the film does a pretty good job. The book actually takes place over a number of years. It goes all the way to 1935, and it even has some shots. Well, in the very beginning of the movie, they were the young boys. It's like 1917. That in the hog pen, that starts off like the book does. So it's like the brothers are young, and then it leaps forward to when they're older. And the book does that mostly. There's a few other moments that are kind of skipped, but yeah, basically the time period is right there.
Well, I like that you mentioned that a lot of it was undocumented, because that kind of leads right into my next question, which is about the characters. And I know there's a lot of characters that we know are real, like your ancestors, as well as like Floyd Banner, and they mentioned Al Capone. But then you have some kind of secondary characters, like I know the guy that Jack or even Cricket, that Jack and Cricket take the moonshine to. Gummy Walsh is kind of an associate of Floyd Banner. Couldn't find anything about that. Doesn't necessarily mean that he doesn't exist. I just couldn't find any in the research I was doing kind of before this. But what do you think about the characters? Were there a lot of them that were made up for the movie, or were there some of them that they were actual, we just didn't know about, that you uncovered in your research?
Well, people like Gummy Walsh, for example, he is a kind of a made up or a composite character maybe, mm-hmm. and that's a character that I created to kind of give somebody to work with Jack and things like that. And the Cricket Pate is again also a kind of a composite. There was a guy named Cricket back then, and he was very handy with machines. Mm-hmm. I don't know what his last name was, and his relationship with the Bondurants in general is kind of really unknown. It's not really sure how if him and Jack were best buddies or anything like that. That's something again I sort of added in. The the Jessica Chastain character, for example, that is a character that Maggie's a real person. Ended up with my granduncle Forrest. They were together for years and actually secretly married at some point. And so she's a real person. And as you mentioned, like the Floyd Banner, who is based on another sort of more local kingpin, let's say moonshine kingpin that operated in West Virginia and Virginia, with the last name of Floyd. The last name. So what the movie guys did is they kind of adjusted those slightly. They also they made Floyd Banner like more clearly like from Chicago, this kind of city thing. And the same goes for Charlie Rakes. Probably the biggest transformation that the movie made from my book. And because in the book, I tried to stay as close to the real person, Charlie Rakes, as we know him. And Charlie Rakes was a Franklin County local. I mean, he was sheriff, but he was known. They all knew each other, these guys, which is one of the reasons why I made it really curious for me, because the historical record is clear that, in December 1930 in that bridge, Charlie Rakes really wanted to kill all those brothers. And we're not really, and he said some things, some which are recorded in court transcripts, which are in the book and in the film.
But it wasn't like he was from Chicago and didn't know them before. He knew them, it sounds like, almost all their life if he was local. Wow.
Yeah. I mean, we don't know the extent of it, but it's most likely they have known each other because they're both from this, relatively small area. And I know, but like he like threatened him, and he had lines like, "I thought you Bondurants are hard-boiled son of a bitches." Like that's in the court transcripts, and then that they put that into the film. And I early on in the discussions with John Hillcoat, Nick Cave, they clearly wanted to, the director and screenwriter, they wanted to kind of accentuate the the conflict between Charlie Rakes and the brothers, and by making him an outsider, a kind of a city person, and that kind of thing, just kind of makes the distinction between them. And he's a much more clear villain, because the real Charlie Rakes is not a real clear villain, and it's really unusual. And I devote a fair amount of time to him in the book, trying to kind of come to an understanding, a possible understanding. A plausible understanding of why he might, come to have developed this great animosity to a degree that he wanted to basically shoot them all down, in almost basically in cold blood.
Wow. So what about the other characters as far as their personality? Do you think the movie did a pretty good job of kind of portraying the personalities of, not only the brothers, but also it sounds like they made some changes with Charlie, but the other characters as well?
Yeah, but they stuck pretty close to the book. Other than Charlie Rakes, they stuck pretty close to the book. And the thing about the book, for example, the personality of somebody like Howard, the brother Howard, is there. He has some surviving relatives, but to nobody that could tell us what Howard was like in 1930, and same that goes for all the brothers. And so it was difficult to kind of formulate, I had to go off of some things that I knew about them that they had done. And a lot of the character formation was done from these court transcripts where, I heard, you get to hear Forrest, for example, say various things. He says to one of the sheriff's deputies in court transcripts, he says, somebody's going to die unless you let us across this bridge, stuff like that. These kind of threats, So what I did is I took something like that, plus the fact that he was shot and survived, his throat cut, survived, he had a load of lumber dropped on him and he survived, all these things. And also because he was clearly the leader of the group, I took like those elements and created a personality from that, you know what I mean? And the same goes with Howard. Howard, for example, one of the sort of great telling details in the court transcripts that I found about Howard was that we know he showed up at that shooting late, and they said he was apparently drunk. So here we have the older brother, the oldest brother of the family, and at this pivotal moment, he shows up late and he's drunk. So he's the guy that's drunk and shows up late. And that develops his character to some degree. And Jack, Jack was a little bit different because Jack was my grandfather, and I knew him, but I didn't know him as an 18-year-old boy. So I kind of had to go off of what I could know, my dad and everything like that. And so it's a tricky thing, and I think that the film adaptation for the most part was stuck to my interpretations or character sort of creations. Maggie, for example, basically a total mystery. No real record of her at all, and so I was sort of free to. We know that she moved into that store with them and was working at the store with them for a long time. Apparently, she was kind of quiet or something like that. But there's really so little to go off of that. In the book, one of the things I did in the book, which didn't make it into the film, was that the author Sherwood Anderson, his final novel, he wrote another novel called Kit Brandon, and it's based on this semi-famous female moonshiner at the time that was running around, and so he created this kind of image of her, and she liked cars and she liked nice clothes, anyway, and the idea of being, because I know that this is where it gets slightly postmodern maybe, but I know that Anderson, when he was investigating the Bondurants and the Great Moonshine Conspiracy in 1935, right after that he writes this Kit Brandon novel. That Kit Brandon novel was clearly inspired by there's incidents in that novel that are kind of like the Bondurants. So my thing was like, what if this Kit Brandon character was modeled in part after this character, Maggie? So I kind of took a fictional person, and brought it backwards into this. So the idea being that these are the kinds of games I like to play. They entertain me, pretty much nobody else. But that if you had read Kit Brandon, for example, or if you knew anything about Sherwood Anderson, and then you read this novel, what I've done is provided like a backstory for his not, that kind of thing. And so that kind of helped create her, because none of these guys had letters. There was no diaries. I had very little to go on. It was like court transcripts and a couple newspaper clippings, and then whatever old timers that are still around, like my father. But of course, when he was born in 1932, so nobody. So there wasn't much to go on, very little to go on.
Was there anything to go on then, kind of as how the tensions increased between the law and the brothers? Was that something that was in the court transcripts, or was that something too that you were kind of going off of what you did have to in order to create the story?
Yeah, there was a little bit of both. There was some developing tensions between the Bondurant family. The court transcripts make it clear that it was basically centered around these notions of granny fees or bribes that were paid, and that people were paying bribes and the Bondurants were not, and that was a thorn in the side of the local law enforcement. And it has a lot to do with the Commonwealth attorney, man named Lee. They changed his name because the Lee family in Virginia, they changed his name in the film because the Lee family in Virginia is a very old, sort of powerful family, and they actually threatened legal action. But everybody knew that Lee, Commonwealth Attorney Lee, was he was, the trial in 1935 was they were prosecuting him, and that's one of the great ironies for racketeering and all this stuff. That he'd set up this big scheme, and a lot of the irony is a lot of these bootleggers and moonshiners, like my grandfather and his brothers, were testifying against him. Of course, because he was who he was, he got off and he was acquitted. But everybody knew that he was that he was sort of mastermind of this racketeering scheme, where basically there was all this moonshine being made in the county and all over the place, and the cops knew about it, and like they represent in the early parts of the film where they're delivering to the police, and the police are, and that comes from a variety of known things going on at the time in Franklin County, some historical record. Also, my own father remembers being a young boy and driving with his father, and they would make deliveries like a milk truck. He would run a jar up and put it on the doorstep. I mean, it was in the open and whatever, and everybody was doing fine. Everybody's making a little money, and so Lee comes in. Commonwealth Attorney Carter Lee comes in basically and says, sees an opportunity. He says, you're going to pay $20 for every load or whatever, and we're going to institute this countywide and get everybody in the same system. And what I'm going to, so it's a classic kind of racketeering scheme, and the Bondurants didn't want to go along with it. And there's examples in the court transcripts of other players, other people, other guys who had interactions, altercations, who were sort of forced into it. There's threats being they're threatening the Bondurants on a couple different occasions, things like that. And then it seems to culminate in this shooting. Now, so for example, there are scenes like the main scene where Charlie Rake shows up at the store the first time, and him and Forrest have this sort of stare down and that kind of stuff. That's a wholly fabricated scene that I'm trying to kind of convey what was probably a longer, more subtle set of circumstances that led to them at odds with each other. But it was certainly clear, the historical record, that the Bondurants didn't want to pay or refused to, and they felt they were kind of above this. They didn't want to be controlled in this way. And in that December 1930, basically everybody else was playing along except them, and that's when they decided that they had to be, put down. And one of the things I suggested, that Charlie Rake's, one of the things that irritates him is that the Bondurants have this kind of reputation, which is clear in the court transcripts, that people were afraid of them. That helped me create the characters, but people were clearly afraid of the Bondurants, especially Forrest. And so, it got me thinking, well, you're a sheriff's deputy. You're supposed to be the big man around the county, and you're the law here. And you've got this group of guys that feel they're above the law, and everybody's talking about how they're so tough. They can't, Forrest can't be killed. And that starts to work on you a little bit. And you get a little pissed off about that. And then, for example, there's a scene where at a sawmill, because the Bondurants did run a sawmill too, where Charlie Rakes shows up there and basically gets kind of humiliated, by Forrest, and that sort of helped build that tension. And I think, maybe that's one of the reasons why too they switched it to the Guy Pearce sort of Chicago character, because they needed to get to that quicker. They couldn't have these little incidents. They needed to bring a guy in who was immediately at odds with Forrest, So
Maggie was also apparently from Chicago in the movie, as well as Charlie Rakes, and they kind of mention this almost connection between Franklin and Chicago, which seems kind of odd to me that it's like 800 and some miles away. Was that completely fabricated, or it sounds like a lot of it was really just more local?
Yeah, Maggie was local. Yeah, in Franklin County, it was majority local. The connection is, I think the connection is, like, Hillcoat in particular was fascinated with our classic ideas about the Prohibition period, and Capone and rum running, and that sort of angle of illegal spirits and stuff. And then there's this Appalachian style, and so he wanted to contrast those two, sort of, because everybody's familiar with the Capone Chicago Prohibition gangsters and all that. And I think what he thought was cool was that, we have this Appalachian style gangsters, and what if the two met? What would be the clash between them? But it is true, though, that the amount of liquor that was being produced in Franklin County and some other areas of Appalachia, was being transported to major cities. It was going to other cities. So these guys would have, bootleggers in particular, transport people, would have interactions with city folk and there are numerous stories, anecdotes, and things that I've read in various accounts of guys in long coats, city people clearly showing up with a fleet of cars, in Franklin County, and mysteriously driving out in the middle of the night. So I mean, they're obviously coming in and picking up liquor, so there was dealings certainly between them, and I think that's one of the things that I explored in the book. That and it's somewhat in the movie that what it went, prohibition caused this to go, caused the making of moonshine really to go from a much more local tradition based activity, into a money making machine. It's kind of like, you could equate it to some contemporary, drug enterprises, or something like that, like as the creation of methamphetamine or something. I don't know, whatever, and it like explodes and it becomes really popular. It's cheap, easy to make. So it was like that kind of thing, and so that was an interesting transformation for me too, because I was trying to figure out why would the Bondurants be so like, what was their, and it's because they had this long tradition of doing it this way, and nobody messed with them, and that's the way they liked it, and so this outside influence was very bothersome and all that, and I think the movie in particular really wanted to play up on that, because that always plays well dramatically, the outsider coming in trying to change the ways of the regular folks kind of stuff, so.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that scene where the two guys from Chicago, kind of the outsiders coming in, and the scene with Forrest, where they cut his throat, that was just, yeah. I mean, that was wow. And then it just kind of escalates from there. You have tar and feathering and eventually killing, Cricket. And was that kind of back and forth? Was that something that actually happened? I mean, maybe not from outside characters, but even with Charlie being local.
Yeah.
Or was that kind of played up for the film?
Those events occurred, but they're either we don't really know who did it, or it's most likely it was between factions, competing factions, syndicates maybe, like, so there'd be a sort of a Franklin County syndicate, and then there'd be something in Floyd, neighboring counties would have their syndicates, and then even West Virginia. And so sometimes people would try to kind of come in and muscle each other out. But by 1930, the sheriff's department, under the direction of Carter Lee, is starting to kind of muscle people and push people around. Now, there's a few notable examples. For example, in 1935, like before Carter Lee went to trial, Charlie Rakes died very suspiciously right before the trial, along with a couple other guys. That this guy Henry Abshire, who's kind of in the book, and he's kind of Carter Lee. He's kind of Charlie Rakes' partner. That they cut him out entirely, but he was transporting a prisoner in the middle of the night, and he got shot to death in like a hail of bullets, like 20 bullets, killed him and the prisoner he was transporting, like literally days before the trial. And these are the guys that would have testified against, damning testimony against Carter. So the point is that Carter Lee was clearly willing to use, force, excessive force to get these things done. So we have some evidence of him doing that, but we also have a little bit of evidence of him pushing people around. And then we also have the warring factions. Like, for example, Forrest getting his throat cut. Nobody knows who did that. Nobody was arrested for it. And the conjecture was back then, and remains, that it was either a rival gang, like a group of guys that were like, we want to take over this business, or that they had come to, effectively rob the place, come in and steal his booze and his money, because they knew that this restaurant, his way station, and they do that in the movie. They show him kind of hiding his money in the wall, this little compartment. He's kind of very careful, because that way station would, when the shipments were coming through, he might have, hundreds and hundreds of dollars, a lot of money for that time. And so people would come, and then there's also some conjecture that he got his throat cut just in an altercation. He just they got in a fight, but it was out in the parking lot. It's a couple guys. And then there's the whole, walking to the hospital bit, which is what they say in the newspaper. That's what he said he did. That's all they know. He showed up at the hospital. Well, how'd you get here? I walked, and it was like 10 miles, it was a crazy distance. Doesn't really make sense to me. That helped, obviously develop the kind of legend. But one of the things that I wanted to do, which is the movie, it's in the book and it's also in the movie, was, I'm a realist, and the idea of him walking, holding your neck together, whatever, for losing that much blood for 10 miles in the snow, just not real plausible. So something else happened there, and so I had put on the idea, what if it was Maggie? What if she basically saved him, but he didn't know it, and so he goes on living this persona. And then there's a pivotal moment where she tells him, because she's trying to stop him from putting himself in danger again and again. I'm the one that saved you. You think you're indestructible, but you're not. It was me. And then of course he's like, wait, you were there. If you were there, those guys were there. What happened to you? That is all. That's a fabrication of my own. But what I was trying to do it's kind of like the Charlie Riggs thing. I'm trying to present a plausible scenario of how that might have happened, and make it as kind of realistic as possible, because him just walking 10 miles doesn't really make a lot of sense.
Yeah, for sure. So you mentioned Charlie Riggs apparently didn't die in that shootout, but you had mentioned earlier that your grandfather and Forrest did get shot there.
Yeah.
Was that shootout fairly accurately depicted then, other than Charlie Riggs?
The shootout was certainly one of the scenes that was, let's say, amplified and exaggerated quite a bit. In the real shootout, there was only a couple shots. I mean, basically, in the real shootout, it was he shot Jack, and then he shot Forrest, and Forrest ran towards him. He shot Forrest, and then Howard was standing there, and he was going to shoot Howard, but one of his fellow deputies, Henry Abshire, knocked his hand down, and the gun discharged into the snow. So he was going to 1, 2, 3. He was going to kill the three brothers, and that was it. That was all. Now, that incident. That incident kind of brought the whole thing tumbling down, because there were state and federal people involved by this point. So when this shooting incident occurred, that everybody started paying attention to it, looking at it and like, wait a minute, why is this guy executing people? And so that brought the whole scheme down. You know what I mean? So that did kind of finish the Carter Lee and his whole scheme, but no, not like that. Charlie Riggs died a couple years later, right before the testimony I was saying, and it was unusual. He developed pneumonia and died in like a day. Just like within one day. It was really weird. And so in the book, I sort of suggest that maybe Howard and his brothers had something to do with that. In the book, they find Howard finds them, and because Howard wants revenge, because Howard showed up late, he watches his two brothers get shot by this man, so he's angry, so he takes revenge on him. And in the book, I try to create, again, a plausible scenario and how Howard might have done something to him that caused him to get this like drastic pneumonia that killed him the next day, whatever. But the film, you need a bigger shootout at the end. You need all that stuff. And this time they had Jack, showing up early and all, upset and ready to kill Rakes. He's mad about the Cricket Pate murder kind of thing. So that's all that's all them at that point. And then the way that just a hail of bullets. There's a lot of shooting. There was lots of shooting, and there wasn't all that shooting. So that is like probably the farthest from the historical record, other than like Charlie Riggs not being from Chicago, just the way that whole thing played out. That Forrest gets shot like 5 times, right?
Yeah, it was quite a lot. Yeah.
So but that's filmmaking. That's what they did. And I talked to Hillcutt about it. He's like, we gotta make a bigger thing. And so I understood that. And
So on the flip side of that, were there any parts that you saw in the movie where they're like, wow, they really nailed that? They did get it?
the historical record, or yeah,
Just as far as the accuracy, yeah.
yeah. I mean, I think they did a good job of sort of presenting in the environs of Franklin County, and looked pretty good and all that. You saw bits about how the Great Depression was, people were out of work and coming into, riding the rails, coming into town. There's little clips here and there that kind of help suggest that. I thought it was interesting the way they handled the racial disparity of Franklin County, which is unusual because there were black families there, not many farmers. The next door neighbors of my father's next door neighbors was a black family, the DeShazos, and the way that they played, because they're delivering the liquor to him, which is a scene that I have in the book, seems to be an appropriate characterization of the kinds of relationship they had. I mean, because my father used to play with those kids, and they were quite friendly. However, the members of that family would never like come inside and eat at the dinner table with them. You know what I mean? It was like that kind of. So I thought that was pretty well done, and I think the way that the automobile, how the automobile was becoming a big deal, Jack and his fondness for that. Jack's fondness for rich, sort of nice things. That was a motivating factor that I know. My father told me that his father, my grandfather, told him once that during the Depression there was like this pair of boots in a window of a store, and it cost $2, and like all he could think about is if he just had $2 he would get these boots. Like there was like a big deal to him, And even later on in life, he was a guy that liked nice things. I mean. He wasn't like flashy, I mean, these are nice things in like an Appalachian way, like a nice,
like a nice pair of boots.
Yeah, it's not a. So there were elements like that I thought they did a really good job with. The sort of filling station store that they put together, that was a big part of the set. I thought that was remarkably. I was able to go on set for that, and I was visiting the set and hung around that building for a couple days with my father actually. And that was beautifully done. I mean, the historical detail of that place was really cool. My dad was amazed. He was just wandering around, and like those old cars. I mean, the cars were amazing. They had, that was really beautifully done. The Old Order Baptist Church that Bertha, Jack's love interest, which is that's all true. My grandmother was raised a Dunkard, they call him, Old Order Baptist, German Baptist, and the kinds of I researched about the kinds of ceremonies they had, and what their service was like, for example, and the singing and the feet washing. That's all something they did, and that's one of the really cool things early on was, you have this notorious. When I started researching this for a novel, many years ago, is you have the Bondurant brothers, the most sort of notorious group of villains in Franklin County, and then you have literally the preacher's daughter, and in 1930 they are dating, like they get married like the next year. My father's born in 32, my father the oldest child, so I mean, like, all of this is happening in the midst of their courtship, and I was like, that's fascinating to me. How does that even happen? Like, how do you even get to get together, get to know each other, and then and it's a classic kind of Romeo and Juliet thing. These families couldn't be more different. So that was and I like the way that they worked with that. It kept a lot of the scene, and then there's scenes in there's several scenes that they played really straight from the book, which I was very happy about, but those weren't necessarily the most historically accurate. For example, like, one of my favorite scenes in the book is when Jessica Chastain confronts him with the idea of, that she drove him to the hospital that night, and that, and the suggestion is that those guys did something to her, and she has that line about, none of them ever did anything to me. And it's kind of emotional moment. Like that's exactly verbatim from the book, which is really, which is great. I'm glad they did that. And that's one of my favorite scenes. So, it was a pretty good mix. Hillcoat early on said that they wanted to retain as much historical accuracy as possible. We're going to change some of these things. We're going to do some of these things in the interest of dramatic tension. But and in that way, I think his aims were very similar to mine. To keep the story true, if not in a historical sense, then in a plausibility sense, that these kinds of things did happen, at least to other people, could happen, or likely happened. But you have to imagine scenes and dialogue and all that stuff, because there's no record of these things. And I think that Hillcoat did the same kind of thing. And in the end, overall, I'm really happy with it. Even the Charlie Rake's sort of transformation to a Chicago gangster. I love what Guy Pearce did with it. That's a crazy character, and Guy Pearce is one of my favorite actors and all that. And so, but I understand why they did it. It makes sense, because trying to do a more local Charlie Rake's, a much more nuanced, slower build, all that stuff, it'd be hard to do that in a film, in a 2-hour film. So,
yeah, for sure. Now, afterwards, at the end, after the shootout, everybody kind of ends up happy. Mm-hmm. I know you had mentioned Bertha with Jack and Forrest marrying Maggie, and Howard gets married. Was that kind of the way things ended? Was that pretty accurate as well?
Yeah, that was. And one of the notable things, obviously Jack got married, and my father was born in 1932. So when there's that boy that sits on Jack's lap, and towards the end, that's supposed to be my father. And they had 6 kids, and Howard also had a bunch of kids. Forrest never had any kids, but him and Maggie lived together. That's all true. There's a couple things going on. In one sense, that the Bondurants after that really never again became anything like they were. Like the Bondurant boys kind of stuff was not. That being said, my grandfather was arrested for moonshine a couple times after that later. He actually went to jail 3 different times for a year each time. The last time my dad was in high school. That was like small, that was much more small time. It was a way to make extra money, but it wasn't like it was before. But by the time my dad was in high school, or that last time, it's hard to explain. But even though he was caught and served time there, he was still seen as a sort of upstanding member of the community. There wasn't all the violence anymore. People were still making, obviously making and selling some liquor, and if you got caught by the revenue service or the local sheriffs, whatever, and you weren't able to bribe them off or whatever, that wasn't looked upon as some kind of terrible crime. It was so common that there wasn't much like a social stigma attached to it. So he was still an upstanding member of the community. And after that, by the time, say, like the 50s and 60s come around, Bondurants are out of the business, except in maybe very small private things as far as making liquor. And so, it's it's sort of it's a part of our past, but it's, Howard went on to be a family man and all this kind of stuff. And Forrest was still involved. He still had this shop, and he still got involved in a few things here and there, but it was never like it was before. Now, also, there's a scene in the book that's a lot like the scene at the end, and one of the reasons why I did it that way, I sort of view that scene at the end as kind of a compression of like the next 20 years, where they kind of get themselves out of this crime business, and they become normal people, and this is all this kind of stuff. They start having kids, and you kind of compress it into one day to kind of demonstrate all those things. And part of it also was and I fully admit, was that this is my own family I'm talking about here, and my father. I didn't want wanted to show that the Bondurants ultimately became, responsible citizens, and that didn't go on. So I wanted to end the book, and I'm glad they did the movie too, on that kind of upbeat, that sort of high note. That was important for me. It was important for my relatives to see it. My uncles and aunts and my father, and I couldn't end the thing with them still being criminals. And so that was a kind of a compression of really a journey to respectability that took place over a decade or two. And like I said, by the 50s and 60s, they were all just farming, doing normal stuff. It was all that was gone.
Was there anything in the book that didn't make it into the movie that was like maybe one of your favorite stories, to give people kind of a peek into stuff that's in the book that if they read the book, they wouldn't be able to see in the movie?
Yeah. Well, the whole Sherwood Anderson storyline. I mean, if people are not familiar with Sherwood Anderson, I think they'll enjoy it. And if you are familiar with Sherwood Anderson, I think it's really kind of special. It's one of the things I'm most proud of, the way that I was able to work him into the book. Because when I started researching and I found out that Sherwood Anderson was actually there and roaming around Franklin County, putting together this article that he did, and then reading Kit Brandon, which is clearly based on some parts of it. Sherwood Anderson's one of my literary heroes. I mean, he's arguably the most important prose stylist of 20th century American fiction. I mean, he's the guy that taught Hemingway and Faulkner how to write. So, and his book Winesburg, Ohio, is has to be considered one of the top 10 most important books in American literature in the 20th century, certainly, perhaps in all time, because it created a style and a kind of a template or organizational method, all kinds of things that became very distinctly American, that you see borne out in Hemingway and Faulkner, and then by extension, people like Fitzgerald or Flannery O'Connor, et cetera, et cetera. So vitally important, but also because that book was so large, and then the books preceding that, his career after that slowly sort of kind of diminished. His books became less popular and critically panned, and so his is a sort of unique American tragedy of a rise to fame and then a sort of slow descent. And so by this time in 35, he's struggling. He's struggling already. Faulkner and Hemingway's are their stars ascendant, and they both by this point also they basically pushed him aside. They basically kind of like, and his books, a couple of his books were kind of like, were laughed at. Hemingway in The Torrents of Spring mocked him openly. He had a couple of humiliating episodes, and so you had this kind of broken down man, and so it makes for a great sort of foil to these Bondurant brothers, in that he's trying to find out what's going on, and he's having trouble breaking through the kind of bubble of silence that persists in places like Franklin County, and it's still a very quiet place, and people don't talk about it. People don't talk about moonshine. You don't talk about it. Nobody talks about it. That's why it was really hard. There's no stories. There's nothing written down or anything, because nobody talked about it. And I think that whole element adds a really nice layer to the story, because it provides you with a kind of an outsider perspective. Somebody that's from outside the community coming in. And so the observation he makes, I think, are really interesting for a reader who's not familiar with, that area or something like that. And he's also able to provide a more of a historical perspective. He was a world-traveled guy, and so things like the Depression and what's going on in the stock market, for example, things like that, which barely made much of a ripple in places like Franklin County. My dad said they were poor before the Depression, they were poor during the Depression, they were poor after the Depression. Not much changed. So that whole element, which is about a third of the book, I think adds a lot of interesting context. And in particular, his pursuance of Maggie, which is, as I said earlier, is like he was thinking about her as a character to use in his next novel. So as he's following Maggie around, trying to figure her out. Also in the book, there's a lot more about Howard. Howard in the film gets very little time. Jason Clarke's a great actor. I liked him. I liked he's also the one that he looks very much like a lot of. He looked like Bondurant in a lot of ways. I mean, yeah. But they didn't give him a whole lot to work with in the book. Howard has, just about equal treatment as Forrest and Jack, and he has a whole backstory. He has a whole story of how he came to be the person that he is, and I found that really fascinating. He's probably my favorite guy, just because his story is so particularly interesting and tragic to me. And they left, that's all out. So I think that any reader of the book is going to get a fuller appreciation of all the characters, but in particular somebody like Howard, I think. And then, like we mentioned, the Charlie Rake stuff like that. There's also Maggie gets more. I mean, Maggie, they rush her. She shows up, she's involved, and then there's like all the stuff happening. Whereas in the book, it's a more gradual, even like the kind of awkward courtship of Maggie and Forrest. Now, the courtship between Bertha and Jack, they did keep a lot of those scenes, which is great. I mean, that's like when like the church scene when she washes his feet and he runs off all drunk, and then there's that one where they drive the car out into the field and he gives her that dress and stuff like that. That's all in the book, and obviously that's the main love interest, so they wanted to keep that in, and I'm glad they did. But.
Yeah, well, it sounds like there's a lot in the book that even if you've seen the movie, there's still going to be a lot more. So I guess my final question would be, where can people get the book?
You can still get it anywhere. It's available. It's on Amazon. It's in most bookstores around the country. Certainly available online. It's managed to continue to sell well over the years. I think I think obviously the movie had a lot to do with that, and the based on a true story aspect. A lot of people find that it's funny that the sales always really tick up around Father's Day. Like it's a good gift to give to your older dad or something, you know what I mean? Because like it's the kind of book that he'll read and like, because there's some fighting and shooting and liquor in it, but fine by me, that's cool. So no, it's the Wettest County in the world, and then of course there's a version called Lawless too, which is the exact same book. They just have the title Lawless. Like they couldn't do Wettest County in the world for the film because. It's kind of long and awkward. It also sounds like the pornographic version of the right. I mean, that's the funny thing is you could have the porno version of the book and we don't have to change the name. It's the same. But the big deal they told me was that the wettest, like the idea of wet versus dry counties is something that's not understood internationally. In the international market, as you probably know, is a big deal. They got to be able to sell this in Europe, and so wet. That the people will be very confused by this idea of a wettest county, which is something we understand as Americans. So like they came up with Lawless. They actually somebody else was going to have a movie called Lawless, and he gave him the title. I forget who it was. I was a famous director. It's slipping my mind now. Anyway, but yeah, so Lawless, and then they say, well, do you want to we're going to do a copy of the book and we're going to call it Lawless, and is that all right? Okay, sure, I guess, and so there's some of those are out there too. But yeah, no, you can get it anywhere, and especially Amazon.
Sounds great. I'll make sure to include links to that in the show notes.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for your time, Matt.
Sure. Glad to do it. Thank you.
Once again, I would like to thank Matt Bondurant for taking the time to come onto the show and give us a peek into the true story behind the movie. If you want to dig deeper into that story, I would really recommend picking up Matt's book, The Wettest County in the World. And while that's the only book of Matt's that the movie Lawless is based on, it's not the only book that Matt has written. His most recent book is called The Night Swimmer, and if you like the movie Lawless, I bet you'll like his other books as well. You can find the links to pick up his books in the show notes for this episode over at basedonatruestorypodcast.com. Okay, now it's time for the answer to our 2 truths and a lie game from the beginning of the episode. As a refresher, here are the 2 truths and 1 lie. Number 1. Forrest Bondurant did survive having his throat cut. Number 2. Charlie Rakes was not actually from Chicago. Number 3. Jack Bondurant was not shot in the big shootout at the end of the movie. Did you find out which one is a lie? The lie is number 3. While we learned the big shootout at the end of the movie wasn't really that accurate with what really happened, it did show that Jack and Forrest got shot, which did happen. What did you think about today's episode? If you enjoyed it and would like to hear more interviews, let me know. You can find me hanging out in the Based on a True Story Facebook group. You can also follow the show on Instagram, where it's at Based on a True Story Podcast. Over there, I like to post some photos of the faces and places behind each episode. You can also find me on Twitter, where I'm at Dan Lefebvre, DanLefeb, or if social media isn't your thing, you can shoot me a good old-fashioned email at dan@basedonatruestorypodcast.com. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll chat with you again really soon.